Wanted posters, but this one was different. It was her. The woman he'd almost built a life with, now just a faded image with wanted stamped across it. A cold knot twisted in his gut, a ghost from a past he thought long buried, rising to haunt him under the unforgiving Texas sky. The trail had split years ago, one path leading to the law, the other to a forgotten love. Now, it seemed both roads were converging. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through the saloon's grimy windows, illuminating the usual midday stupor. Caleb sat at his regular table, nursing a lukewarm coffee, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. He was a man of quiet habits, his days on his small ranch outside of dusty Rattlesnake Gulch predictable, mending fences, tending to his few head of cattle, and occasionally riding into town for supplies. His life was solitary, a deliberate choice after years spent chasing outlaws across the territories. He'd found a different kind of peace in the rhythm of the land, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd once embraced. Across the room, Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor, was wiping down the bar with a rag that looked as ancient as he was. His grizzled face, usually set in a permanent scowl, was even more pinched than usual. Caleb noticed the shift in the air, a subtle crackle of tension. Hemlock rarely broke his rhythm, but today he kept glancing towards the door, his eyes darting like a trapped bird. Caleb took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze calm, observing the old man's unease. He'd learned long ago that the smallest tremor could signal an earthquake. Suddenly, a rider burst through the batwing doors, kicking up a cloud of dust that swirled around his worn boots. He was a bounty hunter, Silas Snake-Eye Morgan, a wiry man with a face like dried leather and eyes that seemed to hold no light. Morgan wasn't a frequent visitor to Rattlesnake Gulch, which immediately signaled trouble. He strode to the bar, slapping a crumpled wanted poster onto the counter. "Hemlock, seen this woman?" His voice was raspy, like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. Caleb's calm facade almost cracked. The poster. It was the same one he'd seen earlier, briefly, a shock to his system. Hemlock stammered, "No, Morgan, can't say I have." But his voice wavered, a telltale sign. Morgan's snake eyes narrowed, flicking over to Caleb, who remained outwardly impassive, a statue of quiet vigilance. The image on the poster was burned into his mind, Alara Vance. Her name was like a whisper from a ghost, carrying the scent of wild roses and the echo of laughter. He hadn't seen her face in years, not truly, not until this morning. A slow burn ignited in Caleb's chest. Alara. What in God's name had she done to end up on a wanted poster? His past, meticulously buried beneath layers of solitude and routine, was clawing its way back to the surface. Morgan picked up the poster, his gaze lingering on Caleb for a moment too long before turning to leave. The air in the saloon felt thick, suffocating. Caleb knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his quiet life was over. The poster was a sign, an undeniable summons. He had a choice to make, one that would redefine the dust on his crossroads. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet as Caleb rode out of Rattlesnake Gulch, the wanted poster for Alara tucked inside his worn leather jacket. He'd made his decision. The dust on his boots would mingle with the dust on the trail once more. His destination was the mining town of Blackwood Pass, a rough and tumble place known for its rich veins of silver and even richer veins of trouble. Rumor had it that a woman fitting Alara's description had been seen there. He pushed his horse, Comanche, a sturdy dun with a calm temperament, harder than usual. Every mile felt weighted with a growing dread, a premonition of what lay ahead. He'd been riding for hours when the storm, brewing silently on the horizon, finally broke. Rain lashed down, turning the dusty trail into a muddy quagmire. Comanche stumbled, and Caleb cursed under his breath. He spotted the faint glow of a campfire through the downpour, and steered Comanche towards it, seeking shelter and, perhaps, information. As he neared, he saw a solitary figure huddled beneath a makeshift lean-to. It was a young man, no older than 20, his face smudged with dirt and worry. He wore the tattered clothes of a prospector, his pickaxe lying uselessly beside him. He looked up, startled, as Caleb dismounted. His eyes, wide and nervous, flickered from Caleb's face to the six-shooter holstered at his hip. "Evening, stranger," the young man stammered, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Caleb nodded. "Evening. Mind if I share your fire?" No, not at all." The young man gestured vaguely to the small fire, which was struggling against the rain. "Name's Billy. Billy Summers. Caleb." He settled down, pulling his hat lower to shield his face from the elements. "Tough night to be out." "Tell me about it," Billy mumbled, shivering. "Lost my claim, then this storm hit. Just my luck." He paused, then looked at Caleb, his eyes holding a desperate hope. "You wouldn't happen to be heading to Blackwood Pass, would you?" Caleb's gaze sharpened. "Might be. Why?" Billy hesitated, glancing around as if fearing unseen ears. There's trouble there. Real trouble. Seen a woman, pretty as a sunrise, but wild as a Mustang, causing a stir. They say she robbed the bank. Folks are talking about a bounty hunter, too, a real nasty one." The words struck Caleb with the force of a blow. A nasty one. He knew Silas Morgan was already there, or would be soon. The net was tightening. What kind of trouble? Caleb asked, his voice low, controlled. Billy leaned in, his voice hushed. "The mine owner, old Silas Blackwood, he's got the whole town in his pocket. And this woman, she crossed him. Word is she took something more than just money from the bank. Something he truly valued." He looked at Caleb, his young face etched with fear. "You look like you know how to handle yourself. Be careful, stranger. Blackwood Pass ain't what it used to be. It's a viper's nest." Caleb watched the fire flicker, its flames battling against the relentless rain. The problem wasn't just a wanted poster now. It was a powerful, vengeful man and a town under his thumb. The rain intensified, and the fire, a small beacon of warmth, finally sputtered and died, leaving them in near darkness. Caleb felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. The unexpected storm, Billy's desperate words, the chilling news of Blackwood's wrath, all of it conspired to make him realize how much he'd already lost, the peaceful illusion of his solitary life, and perhaps the precious time he needed to reach Alara before it was too late. The air in Blackwood Pass was thick with the scent of pine and something else, a metallic tang of iron, perhaps, or desperation. Caleb rode into town at dawn, the last vestiges of the storm having dissipated. The wooden buildings were grim, unpainted, and the streets were mud-churned paths. He dismounted in front of the only saloon in town, the Silver Nugget, the sign creaking mournfully in the morning breeze. He tied Comanche to the hitching post, his eyes scanning the street, taking in the suspicious glances from the few early risers. As he pushed through the saloon doors, the scene inside was a stark contrast to the quiet gloom outside. A poker game was already in full swing, and the air was heavy with stale tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey. He found a table in a dimly lit corner, ordering a coffee. His gaze drifted to a faded photograph tacked to the wall behind the bar. A woman, her hair like spun moonlight, her eyes bright with a spark he remembered well. Alara. She was smiling, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. A sudden sharp pang of memory hit him, swift and unyielding. Years ago, dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, just like they did in this dusty saloon. But then, they were dancing in the air above a field of wild poppies, a vibrant red against the green. Alara, her hair unbound and flowing, laughed as she chased a butterfly, her movements light and free. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his, warm and soft, and the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she truly smiled. They had stood by a sprawling oak, its branches reaching like gnarled arms towards the sky. "One day, Caleb," she'd said, her voice a promise, "we'll build something here. Something real." He'd pulled her close, kissing her hair, believing every word. He had seen a future with her then, a small ranch, a life free from the law's endless chase. But then came the telegram, a summons from the marshal's office, a case that couldn't wait. He'd left, promising to return. He hadn't. The memory faded, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt the old ache, the regret of a choice made, a path taken that had led him away from that laughter, that promise. He'd chosen the law, chosen duty over the woman he loved. Now, that choice had returned, a wanted poster bearing her face, mocking his past self. "Lost in thought, cowboy?" A gruff voice broke into his reverie. Caleb looked up to see a man standing over his table, a burly figure with a thick mustache and eyes that held a cynical glint. Sheriff Brody, his badge gleaming dully on his chest. Brody was known to be in Silas Blackwood's pocket, a fact that settled heavy in Caleb's gut. "Just thinking about old times," Caleb replied, his voice even. Brody grunted, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite him, uninvited. "Old times got a way of catching up to you in Blackwood Pass, especially if you're asking about wanted women." His eyes, cold and assessing, bore into Caleb's. "You looking for someone in particular?" Caleb met his gaze, his face unreadable. He had to be careful. Brody was a bulldog, loyal to Blackwood. Revealing his connection to Alara now would be a death sentence for his mission, and perhaps for her. The choice weighed heavily on him. Follow his heart, which screamed to protect Alara at all costs, or follow the remnants of his old life, the reason that told him she was now a fugitive, and he, a former lawman, had a duty. The line between right and wrong, once so clear, had blurred into a hazy moral gray. The air in the Silver Nugget thickened with unspoken tension. Sheriff Brody's eyes were like steel, trying to bore through Caleb's calm exterior. Caleb knew he had to play his hand carefully, every word a calculated risk. The ghost of Alara's smile on the wall seemed to mock his current predicament, a reminder of the life he'd sacrificed for a badge that now felt like a lead weight. "Just passing through," Caleb finally said, his voice level. "Heard there was some excitement in town. Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about." Brody grunted, a cynical smirk playing on his lips. "Excitement? We got plenty of that. Mostly of the kind that leads to a shallow grave." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "But if you're thinking of joining the hunt for our wanted lady, you best think twice. She's got friends, and she's got a knack for slipping through fingers. And Mr. Blackwood ain't too keen on outsiders meddling in his affairs." The mention of Blackwood cemented Caleb's resolve. This wasn't just about a bounty. It was about power, control, and Alara caught in the middle. The memory of her free spirit, vibrant and untamed, clashed with the grim reality of her current situation. He had to confront Blackwood, and soon. Just then, the saloon doors swung open with a bang, and Silas Snake-Eye Morgan strode in, his eyes darting around the room, finally landing on Caleb. Brody straightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Morgan was a loose cannon, even for Blackwood Pass. Well, if it ain't the retired marshal," Morgan sneered, a cruel glint in his snake eyes. "Heard you were sniffing around. Still got a soft spot for pretty outlaws, do we?" Caleb's hand instinctively tightened on the grip of his holstered gun, but he kept his voice steady. "Just doing my job, Morgan. What's it to you?" "My job is to bring in the bounty," Morgan retorted, his hand hovering over his own weapon. "And she's my bounty. Stay out of my way, or you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a bullet." The tension in the saloon was palpable, every eye fixed on the standoff. Brody watched, a subtle smirk on his face, enjoying the spectacle. This was it, the moment everything seemed lost. Caleb was outnumbered, out of his element, and facing two men who wanted Alara, one for money, the other for reasons unknown but surely sinister. He knew he couldn't let them take her. His past, his present, his very soul demanded he fight. "She ain't yours until she's in a cell," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "And that ain't happening." Morgan's sneer twisted into a snarl. Big words for a man riding alone. Just as Morgan's hand began to twitch towards his gun, a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the air. A small boy, no older than 10, stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Blackwood, he's coming. He's got the whole posse." The declaration changed everything. Morgan cursed under his breath, his focus shifting from Caleb to the approaching threat. Brody's face hardened, his smirk vanishing. The game had just escalated. Blackwood wasn't sending a few men. He was bringing an army. The confrontation was no longer just between Caleb and two ruthless men. It was about to become a full-blown war, and Alara was the prize. The news of Blackwood's approaching posse sent a ripple of panic through the Silver Nugget. Morgan, his hunt for Alara momentarily forgotten, barked orders to the other patrons, urging them to barricade the doors. Brody, his face now grim, quickly organized what few law-abiding citizens remained. Caleb, though focused on Alara, saw an opportunity in the chaos. He slipped out the back door amidst the hurried preparations, Comanche waiting patiently where he'd left him. The narrow alley was choked with discarded crates and overflowing refuse. He mounted quickly, his gaze sweeping the rooftops for any sign of Alara. He knew she had to be close. He felt the dull ache in his side, a phantom pain from a bullet graze years ago, reminding him of old battles and the cost of every decision. He spurred Comanche down a muddy side street, the familiar clatter of horse hooves on rough ground, a stark contrast to the sudden, eerie silence that had fallen over the town center. The usual sounds of a mining town, pickaxes clanging, voices shouting, the distant rumble of ore carts, were absent. It was the silence before the storm, a stillness that pressed in on him, amplifying his isolation. Even surrounded by the bustling, if now terrified town, Caleb felt utterly alone, a solitary rider on a dangerous quest. Suddenly, a flash of movement on a nearby rooftop caught his eye. A figure, agile and swift, darted across the eaves. Alara. His heart leaped, a mix of relief and renewed fear. She was alive, but exposed. He urged Comanche forward, riding parallel to her path, his eyes scanning for Blackwood's men. As he rode, a memory, vivid and painful, bloomed in his mind. He saw himself, younger, stronger, riding into a small farming community. A blizzard had hit, cutting off supplies, and the townsfolk were desperate. He'd led a relief effort, navigating treacherous mountain passes. He remembered the feeling of accomplishment, of doing good, of upholding the law. He remembered the weight of his badge, heavy and significant, a symbol of his purpose. The memory was bittersweet. He had chosen that path, that duty, and in doing so, he had left Alara. Now, his badge was gone, his purpose blurred. He was no longer a lawman, but a man driven by a ghost from his past, riding headlong into danger for a woman who was now a wanted fugitive. He pulled Comanche into the shadows of a stable, dismounting quickly. Alara, seeing him, dropped silently from the roof, landing with the grace of a cat. Her face was smudged, her clothes torn, but her eyes, though weary, still held that familiar spark. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice a mix of surprise and something akin to disbelief. "Alara," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but time was a luxury they didn't have. "We have to go. Blackwood's coming, and he's bringing an army." She nodded, her gaze serious. "I know. He won't stop until he has what I took." "What did you take?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for answers. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice low. "Not money, Caleb. A ledger." It proves he's been stealing land, extorting miners, even murdering those who stood in his way. The revelation hit him with the force of a punch. Alara wasn't just a bank robber. She was fighting for justice. The same justice he had once sworn to uphold. This was a chance, a dangerous one, but a chance nonetheless, to right a terrible wrong and perhaps to finally set things straight with Alara. But it came with an immense risk. He could right away, disappear back into his quiet life. Or he could face Blackwood and risk everything. His life, his freedom, perhaps even the lingering hope of reconciliation with Alara. The choice, stark and unforgiving, hung in the silent air. He looked at her, then towards the approaching sounds of Blackwood's posse. He had to decide now. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. The stable, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground. Blackwood's men, a ruthless, well-armed force, had surrounded them. Caleb and Alara, cornered, fought back with a desperate ferocity. Caleb moved with the practiced ease of a seasoned gunfighter, his shots precise, his movements economical. Alara, surprisingly adept with a small derringer she carried, moved like a shadow, surprising their attackers. Yet, despite their combined efforts, they were outnumbered. A bullet grazed Caleb's arm, sending a searing pain through him, but he grit his teeth and kept firing. Then, a dark figure emerged from the smoke and dust. Silas Blackwood himself, his face contorted with rage, a heavy shotgun clutched in his hands. He was a corpulent man, but his eyes held a chilling intensity. "Give me the ledger, Alara," Blackwood roared, his voice echoing through the stable. "And this can all end." Alara clutched the worn leather-bound book to her chest. "Never. You'll never get away with this, Silas." It was a standoff. Caleb, wounded and weary, knew this was the moment everything hung in the balance. He glanced at Alara, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes still burning with defiance. He remembered the young woman who had chased butterflies in a field of poppies, and the weight of his choice so long ago pressed down on him. He had chosen the law, and now the law was a corrupt man with a shotgun. In a split second, a plan formed. "Alara, the back!" he yelled, drawing Blackwood's attention. As Blackwood turned, Caleb fired, his bullet catching Blackwood in the shoulder. The mine owner staggered, roaring in pain and fury. The distraction was enough. Alara, moving with a newfound burst of energy, sprinted towards a narrow opening at the rear of the stable, kicking through a loose board. As she disappeared, Morgan, who had been lurking at the edge of the stable, lunged at Caleb. The two men crashed to the ground, a tangle of fists in desperation. Morgan was wiry, but Caleb, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to protect Alara, fought with a primal fury. He disarmed Morgan, pinning him to the ground, his gaze cold and unforgiving. Blackwood, though wounded, was still alive, his shotgun now aimed at the gaping hole where Alara had escaped. Caleb knew he had to act. He looked at Morgan, then at the enraged Blackwood. The decision was clear, not one of law, but of a deeper, more personal justice. "Brody!" Caleb yelled, his voice raw. "The ledger. It's proof." Sheriff Brody, who had just entered the stable, witnessing the chaos, hesitated. He looked from his wounded boss to the pinned bounty hunter, then to Caleb, who stood bleeding but unyielding. For a moment, the sheriff's allegiance wavered. He had been a pawn for Blackwood, but the evidence of his corruption and the sheer audacity of Alara's act weighed on him. Blackwood, realizing he was exposed, snarled, "Brody, shoot him, now!" But Brody didn't. He looked at Blackwood, then at Caleb, a silent battle raging in his eyes. He had a choice: remain a corrupt lackey, or finally do what was right. He made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his gun. The moment Blackwood saw Brody's hesitation, he knew his game was up. He fired a wild shot at Caleb, then turned and bolted, disappearing into the chaos of his retreating men. The stable was suddenly quiet, save for Caleb's ragged breathing and the distant shouts of Blackwood's retreating posse. Caleb stood, his arm throbbing, looking at Brody. The sheriff nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, complicated moment. Morgan, seeing the shift in power, scrambled away, disappearing into the dust. The dust settled. Caleb walked to the back of the stable, pushing through the broken boards. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the landscape. Alara stood a short distance away, the ledger clutched in her hand. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and something he couldn't quite decipher. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now." She nodded. "What now, Caleb?" He looked out at the vast, open land, the dust still on the crossroads. He had ridden both paths, the law and the love, and neither had given him the answers he sought. But in the crucible of Blackwood Pass, something had changed. He wasn't the same man who'd chased outlaws, nor the same man who'd left Alara. He was transformed, forever marked by the choices he'd made and the choices he hadn't. He reached out, taking her hand. The rough leather of the ledger was cool against his palm. "We start again," he said, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of the old spark returning. "Wherever the dust takes us." And as they turned to face the rising sun, leaving Blackwood Pass behind, the faint strains of a mournful harmonica seemed to echo on the wind, a lonely melody that spoke of lost chances and newfound hope, of a past that shaped them, and a future yet to be written in the endless, shifting dust of the open road.